Right, it's 2 o'clock and it's time to start. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm really happy on behalf of the INTERSECT team to welcome you all to the first webinar in the INTERSECT webinar series. The INTERSECT project is a research project hosted at MF, Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society, and co-organized with the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. And the aim of this project is to analyze Islamophobia as a global phenomenon. And you are most welcome to learn more about our project at our website, intersectingflows.com. The next webinar will take place on the 17th of September with Professor Sindre Bangstad with a talk titled Burning the Quran, Blasphemy, Free Speech and Hate Speech in Norway. But our first speaker in the series is Professor Torkel Brekke, professor at OsloMet and also co-organizer of the INTERSECT project. So before we begin and give the floor to Torkel, I would just like to remind the audience and the participants about the rules. Now, Torkel will give a talk for 30 minutes, and then we open up for a Q&A. Technically, the Q&A will be open throughout Torkel's presentation, and when he is finished, we will read out the questions. Torkel's talk, but not the Q&A session, will be recorded. We are recording at the moment, and for that reason, we will not be doing video participation for the attendees. And I will moderate the debate, so please send us the questions, and not in the chat room, please. And we lock that one during the Zoom meeting as well, just for your information. So, Professor Torkel Brekke, we're very happy to have you to have the first lecture in our Falls webinar series, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Iselin. So let's see if I can start by sharing my screen. Is this working? Right.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So my title today is how can we explain the different patterns of globalization in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? Now, Professor Frydenlund has already said a few words about the context of this talk, but I'd like to follow up that a little bit by saying firstly that this talk is part of the INTERSECT research project, and you can read more about that on the web pages in the first bullet point here. As Professor Frydenlund said, this is hosted by the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. But there's another host here, which is the Center for Research on Extremism, CREX, at the University of Oslo. So this project relates both to what's going on at MF and CRX. Finally, I'd like to say to everybody that my main affiliation is with the Oslo Metropolitan University in Oslo, obviously. And if you would like to get in touch with me, comments, questions, or anything, you can reach me on the email address in the bottom bullet point here. Also, before I get into the substance of today's talk, I should give a few caveats. This talk is not a presentation of my empirical research that will be done under the umbrella of INTERSECT. So if you expect me to present a lot of new data about Islamophobia, you will be disappointed. I will not go in depth on the history of previous research. There's a vast research literature on anti-Semitism, and there's also a growing research literature about Islamophobia. And there are literally hundreds, perhaps even thousands of references that could have been relevant to talk about or litter in my slides today, but I'm not going to do that because I want this to be an inclusive talk that engages ideas and not previous research as such. Also, I'd like to say that this is not going to be a deep discussion of the terms themselves, the terms anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I'm sure that most of you already know that both of these terms, they are contested, they have a political life, and they are much debated in the media and so on. And we're not going to go deeply into those questions today. So what I want to do is rather to do some conceptual groundwork for my own empirical research in INTERSECT, but of course I'm hoping that by discussing these concepts and ideas, this lecture and our discussion will be useful and relevant for more people, both within INTERSECT, the project, but also outside, people who are interested in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. I'd like to start with a short extract from the proposal that was sent to the Norwegian Research Council to fund the project that we are talking about here. And this is the extract, and I quote, "In existing research, the global aspects of Islamophobia have received surprisingly little scholarly attention and are mostly treated as parallel local phenomena. In order to address this research lacuna, INTERSECT researchers will study Islamophobia as a global phenomenon transmitted beyond local communities of origin through tropes, persons, and artifacts, and as a phenomenon negotiated at various scales." So I wanted to present this at the beginning of my talk just to give you an idea of what the research project as a whole is about. It's about trying to understand Islamophobia as a global phenomenon, as an emerging global phenomenon, but also something that has to be understood within its many different local contexts. And of course, the challenge for our project will be to look at how local Islamophobias communicate with each other and how they merge in what may be thought of as a global culture. And we'll get back to these points as we move on. Now, comparing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia has become somewhat of a fashion, it seems, in research recently. Not only in research, but also in media and in public discourse. One expression of this is the idea that we often meet in public debate that Islamophobia is somehow the new anti-Semitism. It has replaced anti-Semitism and but serves many of the same functions. This idea is not that widespread, I would say, among scholars doing research on these phenomena, but many researchers have been interested in the parallels and ways to compare Islamophobia to anti-Semitism and also to see how they fit into different historical contexts, you might say. One important text doing exactly this was a book by Matti Bunzl. It came out in 2007 under the title Antisemitism and Islamophobia, hatreds, old and new, in Europe. And the argument in that book, an argument that I think has become quite accepted, was that anti-Semitism was invented in the late 19th century to police the nation state, the purity of nation states, while Islamophobia, by contrast, is a newer phenomenon which is used more to safeguard a supranational Europe. That is one take on the similarities and the differences between the two. Many people also say explicitly or implicitly that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are in a way equivalents. They serve some of the same functions, although the target groups are different, you might say. So what functions could that be? Well, one could, for instance, say that both Jews and Muslims have been used as scapegoats to explain problems in Western societies in different periods of history. And they could serve functions such as bolstering national identity in times of crisis. So clearly, one point of departure from my lecture is that there is absolutely sense in comparing anti-Semitism to Islamophobia. But as I will show, I think that some of those comparisons have been less interesting than they might have been. Okay, so I want to share with you a table from a recent article. This is from an article called Antisemitism and Islamophobia. What does a bibliometric study reveal? So this is a bibliometric study of research papers, research articles about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And if you look at the left-hand column, you would see anti-Semitism is the top row and Islamophobia is the lower row. And if you go to the right-hand column, you will see average citations per paper in the two different fields. And it is very obvious in this bibliometric study that research on Islamophobia is far more cited, far more frequently cited than research on anti-Semitism. There can be several reasons for this, but according to the article, and I think that's a good explanation, the main reason is that research on anti-Semitism has mainly been carried out in the humanities, while Islamophobia studies is a newer field which is mostly going on in the social sciences. And these two fields, disciplines, have very different traditions when it comes to citing other work and so on. But it tells us something about, also about the relative young age of Islamophobia studies and research on Islamophobia relative to anti-Semitism. One of the main ways of comparing Islamophobia to anti-Semitism, both in research and in public debate, is to see both as expressions of racism. Now, in some contexts, that can make sense. In some contexts, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are varieties of racism, but very often, in my view, this is not tested empirically. In order to get away from the difficult concept of race, there appeared from the 1980s an important tradition in research that addressed rather the process of racialization. Racialization processes are processes by which a certain group come to be seen as a race. And in my view, the scholar who most clearly formulated this idea was the racism scholar Robert Miles. Robert Miles has written a number of important works on racism, and he formulated racialization as a concept that would be more exact in understanding how new groups, like religious groups, ethnic groups, would be seen as races. I'm going to quote the definition of racialization suggested by Robert Miles, just to see what it entails. Miles says that racialization processes are processes by which meaning is attributed to particular biological features of human beings, as a result of which individuals may be assigned to a general category of persons which reproduces itself biologically. And the point here is not that anybody's going to remember this definition. The point is that the word biology occurs twice in his definition. So in my view, the research by Miles and many others should alert us to the fact that it's very easy to talk about racialized minorities without really checking empirically the extent to which they are seen as biological groups in some sense of that word. And we need to be careful about doing that and precise about doing that. We need to put that to the test with data. There's another reason why I think that the racism perspective is not really the most helpful when researching Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And that is simply that it risks, it runs the risk of ignoring differences between the two and ignoring the details of the ideas contained in these two cultural models. So, to the question posed in my title, different patterns of globalization. Are Islamophobia and anti-Semitism global phenomena? What would that mean? Well, to answer that, I think it's hard to get around the question, where do we find them? How can we observe them? Where do we observe Islamophobia and anti-Semitism? And here, I better make a little confession, because the fact is that I come to this field not primarily as a scholar of Europe or the Western world, but rather as a scholar of Asia. I've spent a lot of my previous research time on looking at Asian societies, particularly South Asian societies. I think it's also fair to say that INTERSECT as a project really has as one of its ambitions to look at Islamophobia in a global sense by looking at several societies across Asia and across the world. Now, if we look at the research that has been published about anti-Semitism, there are any number of articles and books, etc., about global anti-Semitism. One of the recent and important volumes that come to mind is one edited by Charles Asher Small called Global Antisemitism, A Crisis of Modernity. That book has more than 30 chapters, but no chapter deals with anti-Semitism outside a Western context, really. And that, I think that's quite typical of all, in all the research that is concerns itself with global anti-Semitism, which is, of course, an important subject. Most of the examples, most of the cases are really from Europe and from North America. And then we also find cases from Christian cultures and Middle Eastern cultures. But we hardly, or we never really see examples from, for instance, China, Japan, Thailand, India, etc. And if we go into the really interesting literature about Islam and Judaism in Asia, we will find that whereas there is a lot of talk about Islam, about Muslims as a threat, we could say there is strands of Islamophobia in a number of these societies. It's very hard to identify parallel ideas about Jews and Judaism. I think particularly about the wonderful work of Nathan Katz on the Jews of India. There's also lots of very interesting work on the Jews of China and other parts of Asia. And I think about the literature on Islamophobia in the same societies that go far back in time. And if we had time, we could really go into these examples. We could look at the history of Hindu nationalism, for instance, in India. We could look at the history of Islamophobia in Chinese society, and so on. But the case, in brief, to sum up, the case I'm making here is that if we really think that both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are global, we need to sort of be clear about what we mean by that. And part of that is to identify places. Where do we find this phenomena? Okay, so what I'm saying here then is that we are studying cultural diffusion, diffusion of cultures, of the cultural elements in anti-Semitism and this Islamophobia. And here's a slide just saying a few words about the traditions, the research traditions in social science for looking at cultural diffusion. On one hand, there is a big tradition in political science and political sociology for looking at institutions and how institutions and organizational forms spread from one society to another. But that is not what we are interested in here. We want to look at culture and how, I mean, the big question for our project is to look at how Islamophobia is spreading and emerging as global culture. And that kind of question is better answered by looking to the tools and the concepts found in anthropology. And that is because anthropology and also parts of sociology have dealt with much more with informal culture, with individual behaviors, and with the globalization of culture. And so one of the proposals I'm giving here is that there's a particular strand in anthropology called cognitive anthropology that I think could be of help in conceptualizing Islamophobia as global culture, and that could help us develop the right tools and methods for looking at this. From this field of cognitive anthropology, there emerged in the 1980s a tradition for looking at something called cultural models. Cultural models are mental models, mental schemas that help us process information. And each individual, every one of us, we have thousands and tens of thousands probably of different schemas that help us process information. Without them, everyday life would be impossible. Some of these models are shared by a group, and then we call them cultural models. This take on culture is closely associated with a number of important anthropologists. I'm thinking particularly about Roy D'Andrade at University of California, San Diego. I'm thinking of Naomi Quinn at Duke University, but also Maurice Bloch at the London School of Economics in the UK, and a number of others. Now, why do I think that the theory of cultural models is useful? I'll try to explain this with a few examples. First of all, cultural models are shared and they are stable. I just mentioned that cultural models are shared in the sense that they are cultural. So that is sort of implied in the definition here, but the idea of stability is more interesting. Cultural models are stable schemas in our minds, but they're also stable in culture. And they are stable in the sense that they are passed on to children, but also in the sense that they are stored outside individual minds in literature, in art, in objects, and so on. More importantly, bullet point 2, cultural models shape motivation and action. Let me give you an example. Earlier this year, there was a very interesting book in sociology about parenting. The book looked at how different religious communities in the US thought about bringing up children, and it looked at the cultural models that these various communities had about bringing up children. The point with cultural models as an approach in that kind of research is to do research from the ground up and look at the language that people use to describe the ideas they have. In this case, about children, about the meaning of life, about parenting, and so on. And clearly, these cultural models are, I mean, there are cultural models that are emotions, feelings, and create motivation and action. And this is one of the things that I like about this theory, that it helps us explain why people do things. If you had time, we could also go into bullet point 3, that the theory of cultural models really is a very clear stand in a larger discussion of theory and method in anthropology that sees culture as something coherent and consensual rather than fragmented and non-consensual. This is a larger and irrelevant debate in anthropology and sociology for us at the moment. Bullet point 4. Culture is not just rationalizing and instrumental. This is one of the insights and ideas behind the development of cultural models theory. What does it mean? Well, it means that culture, ideas actually shapes action. It's not simply something that comes after the fact in explaining why we do what we do. We are motivated by culture. And finally, the final bullet point on this slide, models and schemas fill in missing information. That's their job. One of the main jobs of cultural models is to fill in missing information. And this is one of the reasons why the theory is helpful in studying Islamophobia, to my mind. To exemplify this, let's look at this picture of a poster from Switzerland. This is from the Swiss referendum on banning minarets some years ago. So what I'm trying to show with this picture is how our models, how cultural schemas fill in missing information. And we see this with this poster by the use of very simple symbols. We see a woman in niqab, we see several minarets on the Swiss flag. And to people in Swiss society sharing Swiss culture, these pictures, these symbols will fill in and activate. They will activate schemas having to do, for instance, with freedom, the freedom of women, linked to schemas about gender equality, about human rights, and so on. Minarets will activate schemas typically about Islam being a missionary religion, schemas about prayer calls, etc., etc. In a Swiss context, these symbols may even activate schemas about repressive religion more generally, because all Swiss people, even children, know that Switzerland has been a safe haven for religious refugees from the Reformation onward. So my point here is that by using cultural models and cultural schema theory, we are better able to see how symbols and snippets of information activate schemas, activate models that are really deep sets. Also models and schemas that are negative, that we can call stereotypes. So this is really a way into understanding stereotypes about minorities, about Muslims in this case, which I find quite productive and quite powerful. Some conclusions. The first thing I've been trying to say is that comparing Islamophobia and anti-Semitism has become quite fashionable in research and certainly in public debates, in public discourse. Second point, I try to show why I think that the racism perspective on these phenomena is really not very helpful, as it obscures differences between them. It also obscures the real details it can do anyway, when looking at the ideas in the models that we look at here. Thirdly, I try to show that it's a good idea. It can be fruitful to look at Islamophobia and anti-Semitism as different cultural models, and I try to say a little bit about what that means. I try to show why that can be a productive way into research. Fourth bullet point, Islamophobia. If you look at Islamophobia in this way, we really need to understand, I think, that Islamophobia is a collection of quite different cultural models. And this is the main contrast I want to highlight, contrast to anti-Semitism. Islamophobia, as we should study it, is a collection of cultural models that we can find in different cultures, in different societies. But if we look at bullet point 5 here, the point here is that these different Islamophobias, local ones, regional ones, you might say, national ones, are merging, or at least that's our hypothesis. They are merging through globalization. And we need to look at the ways that this is happening, right? So there is a question of the emergence of Islamophobia as a global cultural model and what that could mean. Finally, the bottom bullet point, I think that this calls for a great diversity in methods. I think that when looking at Islamophobia in its local context, we really need to do ethnographic, sociological work that has a focus on language and that really pays attention to the contents of the cultural models in question here. So that's a really detailed bottom-up approach. But at the same time, obviously, we need different methods like online ethnography and more macro sociological political science approaches, where we have ways and concepts to understand how the transnational links come about and how the local communicate with the global, and how the global is shaped by local Islamophobias, but also how local Islamophobias are, in part at least, shaped by global Islamophobia as it emerges. So that was my last slide, and I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and look forward to the debate.
Thanks a lot, Torkel. That was really thought-provoking in many different ways. And I'm really happy that you gave the first lecture in this webinar series as you bring up sort of overarching theoretical as well as methodological questions that are of relevance to all of us in this debate. I would like to encourage the participants to type their questions and send it to us in the Q&A, please. And I will read out the questions as well. So if you could type your questions, please, and then I will read it out. And while you do that, I will take my privilege as a moderator to ask Torkel a question, which has to do with the theoretical tools that you bring up, or analytical perspectives, and it has to do with the cultural schemas. Because if we look into the rise of various local Islamophobias across Asia, what we can see is that although we can find contestation between Muslim and non-Muslim groups across Asia, it takes on a really different shape and form over the last 2 decades, and it becomes sort of a massive phenomenon. So how does your theory of cultural schemas allow for analysis of change? Because you have showed how they can be used to show continuity, but how do we deal with change? Thanks. And while he's answering, then we get the questions.
It's a very good question, and I think it is a question that has been asked by critics of the cognitive anthropology approach. I think you're quite right that when we look at various contexts, things are changing, and any theory needs to account for that. Well, obviously, cultural schema theory and cultural models theory, which is overlapping, more or less the same, allows for change. It's really, of course, I mean, one of the criticism, and I think this is implied in your question, one of the criticism is, of course, to look at cultures as sort of bounded and closed and not really open to outside influence. And that's a problem. And I think that a good conceptualization of these theories, they allow for that. They allow for models and schemas to change over time, so I don't think that there's anything in this theoretical approach that makes that impossible or difficult. But at the same time, I think that the project that we are trying to build here, or that we're building here, also, well, you talk about change and influence across borders, but I also think that we very much need to be aware of the things that do not change. I'm frankly very interested to look at the elements in the cultural schemas, the cultural models that remain the same. And although things can change in terms of scale and intensity and the political fallout of Islamophobia can change, I think that we need to look at what stays the same, the core ideas, and how they travel and don't travel. And that's actually, I think that's one of the reasons why I think that a comparison to anti-Semitism is interesting. Because the point I was trying to make about the relative globalization of these two phenomena is that anti-Semitism is in one sense global, but if we look at the insights, the actual ideas and concepts of anti-Semitism as a cultural model, we understand why it doesn't travel in the same way as Islamophobia is able to do. There's something, I shouldn't go on